So in this Zelda, Link gets his masturbation arm ripped off, then his girlfriend, or how as a Japanese Link would call it his living owner hole, gets teleported away. Not wanting to feel like a stranger is pleasing him for the rest of his life, thanks to his new arm, he pieces out by making a belly flop from the sky. In all seriousness, Tears of the Kingdom is a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild. It takes up after the story is concluded, when Zelda and Link are exploring a dungeon below the castle. They awaken a Ganon-like creature, Link gets all his powers drained and Zelda, of course, gone. Zelda games have a story, and I mean this sentence literally. All Zelda games have one story. Zelda is in danger, the world is about to get destroyed by Ganon, and you have to save it. The names might change a bit, but this apocalyptic plot is present in all of the games. The only game I remember having a different story was the one with the instruments, where Link is the one who destroys the island by waking up the bird that dreamed of it. I had a different version of the game for some strange reason, but let's not dwell on that. I will not go into the story as a whole. I might comment on some points, but the story is not worth going into, because the Zelda games are gameplay oriented and not based in reality. Water prevents fall damage, no matter the height. Platforms don't break, no matter the weight. Tears of the Kingdom sets his own rules, and that is for the better, because the fairy tale atmosphere allows certain derivation from reality. Unlike some other games that are about physics, but have wormholes you can travel through in a jumpsuit. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is Breath of the Wild 1.0. It brings new features and many olds, and that is exactly the problem. Breath of the Wild was groundbreaking and even inspired Genshin Impact. But even if Breath of the Wild was a 10 out of 10, which it wasn't, then Tears of the Kingdom cannot. Inventing is more impressive than reinventing. When in early human history some fellow came up with the wheel, it revolutionized civilization and the human species as a whole. If I would now announce that I have invented the wheel, no one would react, because we already have the wheel. It's not impressive but embarrassing, and I find this the best adjective to describe Tears of the Kingdom, because it has 99% of all the flaws of Breath of the Wild and brings very little new features. It still runs like a horse without legs, looks like the thumb of a clumsy carpenter, and has so little quality of life features that it often feels like aliens programmed it based on what they think humans would like to play. Which also explains the controller. Let's say we have a game that costs more than most other games, that was developed over 6 years, exclusively on a console the development team owns. They had full control over the game and the environment on which the game runs. If that game now has frame drops, stutters and bad graphics, we could agree that this would be embarrassing for the developer, right? A normal person would assume that a game with this budget of time and money would have a decent quality. We can agree on that, right? Tears of the Kingdom is that hypothetical game, and it brings me no joy to tell you that it has all the technical difficulties from above. Breath of the Wild also had these problems, but it was the first game and the whole engine has to be programmed, but Tears of the Kingdom has the exact same engine and no improvements at all. A possible defense might be saying that the Switch has poor hardware, so the developer has limitations. A Switch costs around 2/3 of a PlayStation 5, and the PlayStation has 3.5 faster CPU speed, around 10 times the T-flops, 3 times more RAM, 20 times more bandwidth, 3 times faster GPU, and some minor details. All in all, we can say that the PlayStation is around 50 times better than the Switch and costs only a margin more. That means you got ripped off. Well, me too. But coming back to that argument, you are essentially saying that Tears of the Kingdom cannot get better performance because Nintendo ripped you off with old cheap hardware, which sounds hollow to me. This may not be a big deal to most people, it's certainly not for me. I can forgive some stuttering and poor graphics. But we need to acknowledge that Nintendo takes a lot of money for their consoles and games and cheaps out on hardware and voice acting, by the way. Not even the intro is fully voice acted. The movement of Link has not changed since Breath of the Wild. which was running, jumping, gliding and climbing, all limited by Link's stamina. What was most impressive in Breath of the Wild was the dedication to absolute freedom. There are no invisible walls. If something is visible, you can climb it. Your movement options are for exploring, while in combat your movement changes slightly and you almost never use the glider or climbing while fighting. Your powers are more ambivalent. They can be used for fighting and movement, but I see them a tad more for movement than for combat. In Tears of the Kingdom, one of the core abilities, which is actually new, is the Ultrahand, with which you can lift up anything and combine anything. It's actually impressive what you can do with it, and there are a lot of funny and astonishing constructions players made on YouTube. You can use this often to solve puzzles, traverse between platforms, and even climb or do combat. But the Ultrahand is nothing new. Nintendo just put Lego into the Breath of the Wild engine. It's cool, but most of it was already in Breath of the Wild. They just allowed players to construct with the ability to combine. Another is time reversal. You can use it to throw back objects to enemies, lift you up when a boulder falls from the sky and you can climb onto it, then reverse. You can also use it by combining reversal with the Ultrahand. You first lift up an object, keep it a while up and set it on the ground. Now use time reversal and you can get on top. Fusing lets you combine most things with your equipment. This includes equipment itself, so you can get a shield or a stick. This almost always improves the stats and is the crafting system of the game. In Breath of the Wild you had to scavenge Ganon's castle for some good weapons, but in Tears of the Kingdom you get a good base weapon, often something like a sturdy stick, and combine it with monster materials to form new powerful weapons. It is here where the lack of quality of life features hurts the most. Combining a weapon you have should be as easy as going into your menu, select the weapon, then select combine and choose the material. What you need to do is finding the material you want in your inventory, then hold it. Now out of the menu, lay it on the ground. Now equip your weapon, choose the power to fuse and then use it. This is so obviously horrible that I cannot fathom how this passed testing. This has now nothing to do with the fuse ability, but I have to point it out while I'm at the topic. At some contraptions, which I would call a gacha machine, you can exchange some items to get a roll for special construction materials. We will come to later. You also don't get a menu because that would be not tedious enough. Instead, you also have to hold all items, place it on the machine, which will always play a cutscene. You can skip the cutscene, but not the last part, which will still play. This was cool maybe the first 3 times. But I was bored out of my mind the 10th time. The same is true for cooking. I love the jingle, and how the ingredients, you also have to put in manually, dance in the cooking pot. I loved it for about 5 times. Then it grows old on me. It's like getting your favorite dish every day for years, until you puke. Please, dear developers, don't just look how players engage with the system, but also how often. The last feature, I'm excluding the camera because allows you to traverse solid matter. If it's above you, you essentially swim upwards, and this can be used often. With the exception of the Ultrahand, most of these abilities are at best gimmicks. Cool, but in comparison weak. I now have to criticize many decisions of Nintendo that were also present in Breath of the Wild. You may criticize me for doing a Breath of the Wild critique now instead of Tears of the Kingdom, but that's not my fault, it's Nintendo's, because they have not fixed anything in 6 years. Breath of the Wild had horrible combat. Tears of the Kingdom does improve on that by having horrible combat, but now in the sky and underground. You can block and dodge attacks, but only if you lock on the camera. If you don't, you get hit. If you have locked on, you also might get hit, because sometimes Link does a long jump backwards, sometimes a small one. Sometimes the wrong enemy is locked on. When you evade, you get based on die roll a flurry rush, which slows down time and lets you do damage. Sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. You can get this rush before the enemy even started the attack, or sometimes after the enemy already did the attack. Sometimes you are nothing near the enemy, press dodge and get a rush. Blocking does break your shield, but does only work reliably against enemies that you have locked on. Sometimes you get hit even if the enemy stands right before you and you have your shield up just because Link locked on the wrong dude. Because fighting itself costs resources, this means that a fight might cost you more than it earns based on chance. Combat is frustrating and boring, because even if everything works like it should be, you only ever jump back or raise your shield, wait for the enemy to attack and then punish whatever you are fighting. You cannot go into the offense because most encounters have multiple enemies. If you swing a large weapon, some enemy will strike from your flank. The system was already bad, but that was 6 years ago. Oh sorry, that was written for Breath of the Wild just now. So let's see how Tears of the Kingdom improved on that, but joke's on you because they didn't. The only thing they did improve on is the enemy variety, but I would argue that they only doubled the enemy counter, and that means they actually designed the same amount of enemies like for Breath of the Wild, which was already not enough. Most enemies were already there. It just took 2 games, 12 years, and $140 for a decent enemy variety that scratches on subpar. Genshin Impact did improve on the combat, but that would be an unfair comparison. We should not compare the game of an indie developer and the game of the 8th biggest game developer by revenue. That would be totally unfair if it was reversed. But Miyoho at that time managed to make an overall better game than Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, while being essentially an indie developer who prior only developed mobile games. Just embarrassing, Nintendo. Spirit Ashes is another problem in Zelda, but that might be more personal. When doing the main story you get essentially Spirit Ashes from Elden Ring that lets you summon immortal ghosts. Those spirits take on enemies, do damage and have special abilities. You can turn them off so you can decide if the combat is too difficult or too easy for you, but that is exactly the problem for me, because they don't only impact combat but also exploration. As you know, weapons break after some time, and in Tears of the Kingdom, bombs need to be stockpiled. This means you have to use your weapons to break rocks. And there is a lot of mining in Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. It's even part of the story and progression. One of your companions, the rock dude, can destroy these with his abilities. So you can have an indestructible mining and tree cutting tool, which I welcome. You might say, so what? You can turn these off for fighting and turn them on for mining. That is a valid point, but going into my inventory every time for each little rock and turn these on again was such a hassle that I left them on all the time. The same is true for the wind kit that lets you glide faster and longer. And that created other problems, because they like to cuddle and I do not. You want to pick up anything and the companion comes near you, so you use your ability, which one time nearly killed me while picking up a bomb flower. It was a very bad decision for Nintendo to make the pickup button the same for the ability. And speaking of, they also made the skip dialogue button the same for closing the conversation. So sometimes you want to skip dialogue, but instead say no to the NPC and have to talk to them again. Tears of the Kingdom, like Breath of the Wild, has a heavy incentive on exploration. But it already had problems and is now worse because Genshin Impact exists. Doing anything in-game should have a cost and a reward. Even if you beat an enemy without getting hit them, you still have to invest time. You get materials and in some games experience as a reward. If you spot a secret, you paid with attention for reward. A reward always should reflect the cost. If you beat the strongest enemy in a game, you should get the best reward. If you beat the weakest enemy, you should get the lowest reward. In Zelda, the balance between costs and reward are completely off. Many chests or spots you find in game will get you at best another shrine which improves health or stamina, but only 1/4, a Korok seed which gets you more inventory for weapons, shields and bows, or a Sage Orb which improves your Spirit Ashes summon. Most of the time you get a useless consumable or a weapon which breaks. Genshin in comparison also had poor rewards, but there was never a fluke. All chests did improve your overall score. But in Tears of the Kingdom you are often left with the feeling that you just wasted your time. For one example, I did a puzzle and some exploration for like 10 minutes, then I opened a chest with 10 arrows in it. Speaking of wasting your time, let's talk about shrines. Shrines are simple little puzzles with little rewards. They usually work like this. Introduce a concept based on your abilities. apply it in the next room and expand it in the third room. Sometimes the third is absent. The puzzles are never really complex. For some shrines I'm thankful for that, for others I wish there was a deeper exploration into the system. I can however understand how this happened. First, Nintendo tries to appeal to both children as young as 8 and adults, and because children can hardly raise their intellect to adults, we have to lower ours. Also, when you make dozens of shrines, you cannot put everything in the top 10. You have to keep some concepts for later shrines. Some concepts can also be not expanded, only padded. If a shrine is about addition, it introduces 1 + 1 = 2 as a concept. Then the player is asked what is 3 + 5. Then in the next room you get 50 + 20 + 40. This is all you can get out of addition. You can have more or higher numbers, but the overall concept stays the same. If you know how to solve it, more numbers will just make it take longer. It would increase the difficulty, in quotes, but not the challenge. Which for me is an important difference. A challenge is fun, you overcome it and feel good. Difficulty just means harder, but not necessarily more fun. For example, working overtime as a construction worker might be difficult, but hardly fun, while having more and more complex bosses in a game is more difficult, but also more challenging. You can spot the difference by what you seek out. You seek out challenges and avoid pure difficulty. Search for bosses, but you won't work overtime if you have no gain, like not getting paid. Shrines are too easy and neither difficult nor challenging, in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Most people come to the same conclusion and compare them to dungeons. I heard this from multiple sources, online and in real life, to the point that I had to check for this video. Many say that Breath of the Wild was not a real Zelda game, because it did not have dungeons. For everyone who bemoaned this, I have a joyful message. Dungeons are back, and with it shows that it was never a huge deal. Let's make this by example. There's the Fire Temple. From time alone I think it counts as a dungeon, because it took me about 1 hour. But I also searched every nook and cranny and used some unconventional solutions. All temples, including the Fire Temple, work like this. You have to go to the boss, but there is a roadblock. Then you go into a room and see a problem. You solve the problem in that room and sell them with a second room. In the Fire Temple you have to push your friend into the gong. In one room you see the gong but cannot go to it, so you use your Ultrahand to make a ramp and shoot your friend up. There are multiple rooms, each with puzzles, then you fight the boss, which is unironically a huge step up from the poor excuse boss fights in Breath of the Wild. But if you think about it, 1 or 2 rooms with a puzzle, then the next set. Sounds a lot like shrines, right? So maybe people say that dungeons were more elaborated in older games, even though I never heard one example, so I checked. I gifted my N64 to my little sister, so I watched some walkthroughs of Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past and the OG Zelda. And no dungeon works differently. 3 to 5 sets of puzzles and nothing more complex than in Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild. So everyone who thinks old Zelda games had more complex dungeons, I'm not saying you're wrong. I would like to have some examples. Please explain to me 5 puzzles of a single Zelda game that were more complex, because I couldn't find one. Okay, for the sake of argument, let's say you proved me wrong. Good job. But there's still the question, should all Zelda games have dungeons, or are dungeons iconic for the series? Let's analyze the argument by itself. Statement 1 is, Zelda games had dungeons. Statement 2, therefore dungeons are part of the series. They are Zelda content. Statement 3, Breath of the Wild does not have dungeons and Tears of the Kingdom just has shrines disguised as dungeons. Statement 4, therefore those are not Zelda games. This is essentially the argument. First of all, we usually take aspects we like as typical for a series. We would hardly say that bugs are part of the Elder Scrolls games, and if by some miracle the Elder Scrolls 6 does not have bugs, it is not an Elder Scrolls game. Well, I would say that, but as a joke. So, most X games had Y. Statement 2 is, Y is part of the series. You are not stupid, you know what statement 3 and 4 is. I'm not wasting your time, I'm not Nintendo. Given the argument, we can say that Zelda Ocarina of Time was not a real Zelda game, because all older Zelda games to that point were 2D. The second Zelda game is not a real Zelda game because it's a side-scroller. Older Zelda games had music based on an SID chip, so all newer ones are not Zelda games. You can see how this goes. You could put in any statement of older games into that argument, but using this as a template, even if true, would restrict innovation because a developer might be chained down by always having to put in content some people decided were typical of a series. We cannot say, based on content alone, what is typical Zelda content. Is it the iconography? What is iconic for the series? It's kinda in the name. Is it the movement? Is it the music? The green suit? Being overpriced or on cheap hardware? So let's ask a different question. Who decides what typical content is? Many people would say the author. The author decides what his or her work is about. Many said Fahrenheit 451 is about censorship, and the author said it isn't in the 60s. Then in the 90s, Ray Bradbury changed his mind and said it is about censorship. Then you look him up and he wrote it in 9 days and did not plan anything, so maybe it's not about anything in the first place. If you think the author decides this, then yes, all Zelda games are 100% Zelda games. It's right in the title. I don't think authors decide what their work is about. I think the content itself does. Because of this little mind experiment. Let's say I write a book. That was only one passage. All furniture should be brown. This is not a metaphor and there's nothing to interpret. That is my book. Then if people ask me, what is my book about? I say it's about space dragons waging a war against the space sea mermaids, but only on Mondays. And it follows the young sea mermaid's Captain Floppy Flossel, who saves the universe of the true enemy, later revealed as space vampires. So what is my book about? Brown furniture? Or my space dragon mermaid vampires TM? I cannot give you an answer because my answer is that there is no 100% certain answer. There hardly is in life. All we have is perspective, but for better conclusions we need a lot of those. So here I offered you mine, roast me or agree with me. There might be no certain answer, but there is a solution, which is having difficulty options. Most games have them, and it does not always need to be about combat. Monkey Island is a point-and-click puzzle game, and harder difficulties make the puzzles harder, obviously. We could do the same for Zelda. Normal is the level aimed for children and harder is for adults. You can have 2 sets of dungeons based on which difficulty you choose. To sum it up, exploration is unrewarding, combat is bad and shrines are a waste of time. What is left? Lego. This is maybe the funniest part for me, because you can fuse together nearly anything. It's literally Lego, and it can be used in combat and exploration. You have some ancient tool that lets you glide, fly, surf or shoot. And this is really cool. But there are 2 problems. First, you need more battery power, which you get from the depths, which is just a dark level you can light up. You also should not touch certain spots and there are some unique enemies, but all in all it's just not that special, but very atmospheric and tense. I really like the depths. You need to search them for Zeonite, combine Zeonite to charges and then use charges on your battery. Which means Nintendo won this year's prize for most needless steps for a mechanic again. Congratulations. It takes quite a while to get the batteries, but even if you do, you can hardly use your constructs for a longer period, because some places are too steep, too narrow, have too many trees, or just empty and you want to teleport. The constructs are cool, but only for such a short time that I think it needs a proper environment. There are even tools for attacking enemies, so let me showcase this. You can make an enemy searching podest on top of an enemy searching Roomba with a weapon. They now hunt enemies and give me the nostalgic feeling of watching Robo Wars again. Building your constructs and let them fight enemies is more fun than fighting yourself, which says as much about the combat as it says about the mechanic. Using the Lego mechanic also leads to more freedom traversing the world. In Breath of the Wild, your meter for exploration was stamina, and by extension some resources that restore stamina, but the bottleneck was always the green little disc of Link. With the addition of the ability to make constructs and many of the new ancient tools, it became perfectly possible to play the game to its fullest without upgrading stamina. Instead of gliding, you can build a glider. Instead of climbing, you can build a tower or use stakes for climbing. The player is presented with this freedom, but this also has its own baggage in form of old habits. Many players like me will use primarily climbing and gliding to traverse the map, but I can only suggest a run, or if you don't want to commit to such a lengthy time endeavor, a few hours of self-restriction. Use only your abilities and never climb or glide, except for a short distance or to prevent fall damage. It makes you appreciate the new mechanic and leads to new solutions. Most of these problems could be solved by difficulty. Considering difficulty, games can be broken in many ways. If the game's difficulty meets the player's skill, we call it the flow, while having higher difficulty will result in frustration and having lower result in boredom. I made this point before. Tears of the Kingdom, like its predecessor, is broken on the lower end of the spectrum. It is too easy. This is the fault of the combat, which if you don't rush getting a high armor will be fairly challenging. The saving system was the first crack, and is so lax that even when defeated, there is hardly any penalty. For comparison, the difficulty in Dark Souls came in part from the run to the boss, where players, at least in their first Soul game, had to fight difficult enemies again to reach the boss. It's one of the key experiences for the first time playing a Souls game. Imagine that Dark Souls lets you save after each enemy, and if you die you get full health. And when fighting a boss it saves every 10% of health. This would break the game as it is, as it does in Tears of the Kingdom. While the saving system cracked the game difficulty, the healing system broke it completely. Healing is done by pausing the game and eat your inventory, like in many Elder Scrolls games or in Genshin Impact. The key difference is that in those games that are more than 10 years older, it is restricted how many you can eat at once, giving you a sure heal, but not indefinitely. In Tears of the Kingdom you can fight as long as you have resources, but those are abundant. I think the system itself works as intended, because Nintendo kept it as is. This opens a new question, which is the reason, and my guess it's for children. A child of 8 years might find the game too hard, like it might find the puzzles also too hard. I searched for this and found an internet site that let kids write reviews, and many wrote that the game is really difficult and you need to think a lot, which confirms my suspicion from the shrine part. But the solution is still the same: difficulty options. You can keep the game as is for the children difficulty, but for adults make adjustment to both saving the game and a restriction on how much stuff you can eat. This is a minor change in the system and would have a major impact for a proper difficulty. I cannot see a good reason for not having both, and it is a shame that whenever I see enemies I feel exhausted instead of excited, because I know I will have buggy, easy combat that takes too long and no reward to speak of. For the next part I will talk about some oddities that not fit well in one section. Most video game players break off the narrative of games between lore and main story. Some may call it setting or side stories, but the cut is most of the time between what is presented to finish the game and what is not. For example, speaking to a random non-essential NPC would be for the lore. The same is true for reading books. I am already very dismissive about the story, but the lore is even worse integrated. If you talk in Tears of the Kingdom to some NPCs, or even on the end of side quests, you get some lore tidbits, but these always just reveal what you already know. Finding an ancient text reveal that there is a great calamity under Hyrule Castle, which is literally the opening. Seeking out lore is never worth it, because it is tautonomous. The overarching story is even very depressive if you think about it. According to the game, Ganon attacks around every 1000 years, and your only job as a chosen one is sealing him, not defeating. Link has the sword that seals the darkness, not the sword that beats the living shit out of the darkness. Link is the hero of procrastination, because the problem will come again and destroy the world just some time later. The story is already neither deep, complex nor dark, because it should also fit the taste of children, so it never really comes up that Zelda's father abused her for years, but in the absence of a deeper story is nothing else, and that is the problem. Another mishap is the control, and I would bet that many had this experience. Tears of the Kingdom uses, like almost every other Switch game, a vastly different control scheme to any other game or console. If you come from the Soul series or any other game you would control with a controller on PC or the PlayStation or Xbox, you will find Zelda more difficult than it needs to be. I cannot count how often I push the wrong button just because Nintendo needs to do their own shit. From my standpoint, there should be a general control scheme to all games, and if your game derivates from that, it should have a good reason. We all could agree on Nintendo's scheme, but given that most games already conform to one or two different schemes, having just Nintendo go with the times would be less work than the other way around. The only way we can force this is by pointing it out every game and give it a lower score. For me alone, this would cost them 1 point. I hope other people on YouTube or even magazines will also start criticizing Nintendo for this, but given the blind praise it got despite all Tears of the Kingdom's flaws, I see little chance to that. You will often find Addon, who holds up a sign to his boss Hudson, the one from the first game who built Terrytown. Your goal is to stabilize the sign so you can build a foundation, but refuses to let go and put the sign onto the ground out of respect. He will stand in snow blizzards, the desert, in rain, and through the whole apocalypse, just trying to protect a sign despite being his boss, who probably does not even care much. So Nintendo finally made a truthful representation for their hardcore fanbase, who probably also look like him. The depths are by far the best content in the game when it comes to exploration. In the depths, everything is dark, and with that I mean really dark. What most players will notice is a faint orange glow, which turns out is not Donald Trump's re-election, but a root that emits sunlight. Those function as towers that also emit light, permanently illuminating a part of the depths. There are more roots than overworld towers, and it took me an embarrassing amount of time to notice that under each shrine is a root. What makes the depths so great is the subversion of exploration. In Tears of the Kingdom's overworld, as well as in Breath of the Wild, Fallout New Vegas and many other open world games, exploration is cognitive driven. You see a landmark from a distance and wonder what it is, so you explore. This was already pretty genius in Fallout 3 and Breath of the Wild, because it makes exploring a task the player gives to themselves, motivated by their own curiosity. In other games with question markers, this works suboptimal, because exploration is made a core. The depths subvert this by removing all cognitive options besides lighting the roots, and those are not always visible. Sometimes they are behind a giant rock or mountain. With the oppressive atmosphere and the corruption mechanic, that removes one health semi-permanently unless Link gets sunlight, the depths are by far more dangerous and omit a sense of foreboding doom. Your motivation thus changes from seeing a distant landmark and being curious to being able to see anything at all. This is no free-spirit exploration, but needful survival. The ground also has corruption, which makes even walking something dangerous. You want to make this area safe and survive by getting Zeonite, which you need for your batteries. I touched on this before but wanted to elaborate on this. It is a shame that the frame drops significantly in the depths, and everything has the same texture. More ruins or diverse terrain would have worked wonders. Instead we got just a dark open space with very little to find. For the last point, I want to show how much Nintendo sheeps out on you. During the main story, you find sages and solve their quest. Each one gets a cutscene and it's always the same.
Yes, I am your ancestor from a time long past.
Yes, I am your ancestor from a time long ago.
Indeed, I am your ancestor from a time long past.
Yes, your ancestor from a time long past.
You defeated that monster, the source of those foul rocks. But it was the Demon King who summoned it. He sent that monster to keep you from obtaining the stone you just found. My secret stone.
That monster you defeated, the source of that intense blizzard, it was summoned by the Demon King. He thought it could stop you from obtaining the stone you just found. My secret stone.
You bested the monster that sullied our domain, but it was a servant of a greater evil, the Demon King. His true purpose was to prevent you from obtaining the stone that you just found. My secret stone.
The Demon King is responsible for sending the monster that caused the Sand Shroud. But the monster's true purpose was to prevent you from obtaining that stone. My secret stone.
Secret stone? Demon King?
Huh. So this is the first you've heard of any of this. Then listen carefully to what I have to say. Let me tell you about the imprisoning war and the duty of our people.
Demon King? Secret stone?
This is a lot to learn all of a sudden, I know. But listen while I tell you what happened in the past. A tale of the imprisoning war. And the mission our people must accomplish.
That stone that you are wearing.
Yes, and it is important you know more about the stone and the Demon King. So listen closely to what I have to say. It concerns the imprisoning war and the destiny of our people.
Demon King? Secret stone?
Don't worry. You will understand soon enough. Let me tell you of events in our distant past. The events that shaped our people's destiny during the imprisoning war.
The rest of us survived, and it wasn't long after that climactic battle that someone came to see me. Her visit would set the Goron's duty in stone. The Sage of Time, one of the 6 sages.
The magic restraining the Demon King will be undone. He will return. When that time comes, a noble swordsman named Link will oppose him. But Link will need help. Lend him your power. Your fire. The Goron's mastery of fire.
In that moment, the duty of the Goron people was clear.
Another of the 6 sages, the Sage of Time, came to visit me, and her request would define the Rito's mission in the future.
Another of the 6 sages, the Sage of Time, came to visit me, and the destiny of the Zora was made crystal clear.
Another of the 6 sages, the Sage of Time, came to visit me, and she set the Gerudo on our destined path.
The magic restraining the Demon King will eventually be undone. When that time comes, you must help Link. He is a noble swordsman who will fight that monster. The Demon King will return. The magic binding him will be undone. When that time comes, a noble swordsman named Link will oppose him. The magic restraining the Demon King will eventually be undone. When that happens, a noble swordsman named Link will oppose him. We must help. Lend him your power. He will need the Zora's control over water. So please, he will need your assistance. Lend him your power. The Gerudo's control of lightning. But Link will only succeed with the Rito's help. Summon the winds and support this hero.
It was clear what part the Rito would play.
The course of the Zora's future was clear.
The path of the Gerudo was clear at that moment.
They copied and pasted the same dialogue 4 times. There is so little dialogue during the main story, and they still cut corners. I don't know how someone can defend this. Nintendo did a good job with Breath of the Wild, and then they did almost nothing for Tears of the Kingdom. Even worse, they did not improve on the objective flaws on Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom is not a bad game, it's just embarrassing. Farewell.